Asylum Inc. presents The Doctor's Findings. The Yearling Room. The fluorescent hum above Elijah Hann's desk had developed a stutter, casting irregular shadows across the quarterly reports that blurred before his tired eyes. 37 years of corporate existence had carved grooves into his face deeper than those left by time alone, and tonight the building felt different. Predatory. The usual after-hours silence held a weight that pressed against his temples like gathering storm clouds. He had stayed late again, though he could not recall deciding to do so. The elevator's descent to the parking garage seemed interminable, the numbers above the doors flickering in sequences that made no mathematical sense. When the doors finally parted with their familiar wheeze, Elijah found himself facing not the familiar concrete cavern of sub-level parking, but a corridor he had never seen before. The walls were paneled in dark wood that gleamed with an oily patina, and the air carried the scent of something ancient, not decay, but rather the opposite, as if time itself had been preserved in amber. Fluorescent tubes stretched ahead in diminishing perspective, their light cycling through spectrums that hurt to observe directly. Elijah stepped forward, his leather soles whispering against carpet that felt subtly wrong beneath his feet. Too yielding, too warm. The corridor terminated at a door marked only with a brass nameplate. The Yearling Room. Below it, etched in smaller script that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it, were the words, "To move forward is to molt." The handle turned before he touched it. Beyond lay an office space that defied the building's architectural logic. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, lost in shadows that moved independent of any light source. Filing cabinets lined the walls in ordered ranks, their metal surfaces reflecting not Elijah's image, but something that writhed just beyond the threshold of recognition. At the room's center sat a mahogany desk, its surface dominated by a single manila folder. Elijah approached with the slow deliberation of a man walking toward his own execution. The folder bore his name in a script he recognized but could not place. His own handwriting, perhaps, but from a time he could not recall. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, hundreds. The first showed him as he was now, standing in this very room, holding this very folder. The next captured him perhaps a year younger, the lines around his eyes slightly softer, his hair marginally thicker. The third photograph revealed him at 35, then 34, then 33. Each image portrayed him in the same pose, in the same impossible room, examining the same folder with an expression of mounting horror that mirrored his current state perfectly. His hands trembled as he shuffled deeper into the collection. 28, 25, 21. The photographs continued their relentless regression, each one a perfect documentation of his younger self discovering this same terrible truth. At 18, his face still held the roundness of adolescence, but his eyes already carried the weight of this knowledge. At 16, the school uniform he wore belonged to an institution he had no memory of attending. At 14, the background had changed, no longer the Yearling Room, but some other space equally impossible, equally wrong. The photographs became increasingly disturbing as they progressed backward through his life. At 12, he wore clothes that belonged to no fashion he could recall from that era. At 10, the lighting in the images took on a quality that hurt his eyes, casting shadows that fell upward. At 8, his younger self's smile held secrets no child should possess. 6 years old. 4, 3, 2. The final photograph showed an infant lying in a crib, made of materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The baby's eyes were open, alert, and filled with an ancient recognition that belonged to no newborn. In the background, barely visible, stood figures in white coats, their faces obscured by surgical masks that somehow conveyed expressions of profound satisfaction. Elijah stumbled backward, the photograph scattering across the floor like leaves in a wind that touched nothing else in the room. The images began to move, subtle at first, a blink here, a shift in posture there, but with increasing animation as his panic mounted. His younger selves turned their faces toward him in unison, their mouths opening in silent screams that he could hear nonetheless, a sound like the universe itself being slowly torn apart. The room began to expand, its walls receding into infinite distance, while somehow simultaneously pressing closer. The filing cabinets opened of their own accord, revealing not documents, but windows into other versions of this same moment, endless repetitions of his discovery playing out in parallel dimensions of horror. In some, he was older when he found the room, in others younger. In a few terrible instances, he was not human at all, but something that wore his form like an ill-fitting mask. Understanding crashed over him like ice water. He was not discovering his past, he was witnessing his future, an endless cycle of temporal regression that had already claimed countless iterations of himself. Each photograph represented not a moment preserved, but a moment yet to come, a stage in his inevitable journey backward through time, until he reached that impossible infant in the light-consuming crib. The whisper phrase echoed in his mind with crystalline clarity. To move forward is to molt. He was shedding his years like a snake discarding its skin, each discovery of the room peeling away another layer of accumulated time. The photographs were not records but prophecies, documenting the stages of his unraveling. Behind him, he could hear the sound of footsteps, his own footsteps, belonging to an older version of himself who had yet to find this room, who still believed in the linear progression of time and the permanence of memory. That version would arrive here eventually, driven by the same inexplicable compulsion that had brought him here, would discover the same photographs, would experience the same terrible revelation. And before that version, an even older one would come, and before that, another. An infinite regression of Elijahs, each one shedding time like dead skin, each one moving backward toward that final image of the impossible infant whose eyes held the knowledge of endings. Elijah tried to run, but his legs carried him deeper into the room instead. With each step, he felt something fundamental about himself slip away. Not memory, but the very capacity for memory. His reflection in the polished surfaces of the filing cabinets showed a face incrementally younger, the accumulated weight of years burning away like pages in a fire. The fluorescent lights above pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat that was not his own, that belonged to something vast and patient, that fed on temporal marrow. Somewhere in the building above, another Elijah was finishing his quarterly reports, would soon discover an elevator that descended to impossible depths, would find a corridor that led to revelation and regression. The photographs on the floor had begun to fade, their images dissolving as the futures they depicted crystallized into present reality. Elijah knelt among them, watching his life story evaporate into the ether of untime. Soon, there would be nothing left but the Yearling Room itself, waiting with infinite patience for the next version of himself to discover it. In the distance, growing closer with each passing moment that moved in reverse, he could hear the cries of an infant, his own voice, but from a time that was both distant past and immediate future, calling out in a language that predated words, speaking truths that unmade themselves in the very act of being spoken. The room pulsed once, like a heart in the darkness, and Elijah Hann began to molt. My delightful moths drawn to the flame. Tonight you witnessed poor Elijah Hann, a corporate drone who discovered that time itself can be quite the predator. You observed our unfortunate protagonist stumble upon the Yearling Room, where those photographs documented not his past, but his horrifying future. An endless regression through his own life, shedding years like molting skin, until he reached that impossible infant with ancient eyes. You watched each version of Elijah destined to find this cursed chamber, each doomed to walk backward through time, while the next iteration approached from behind, trapped in an Ouroboros of temporal decay. Fitting that within the labyrinth of corporate ladders and quarterly reports, the ultimate horror you witnessed was not moving forward, but being forced to molt away all that ambition has accumulated. If you found yourself stirred, unsettled, or just a bit more wary of shadows, consider offering a like to feed the entity that powers these tales.
And should you subscribe, you may yet survive to hear the next whisper from the void.